So I'm thinking we should get started. Convene the April 2nd meeting of the Winchester Committee on Community Preservation. The main feature of which is Stuart giving us a presentation tonight about how to implement the Community Preservation Act. Now, we have a few things to talk about pertaining to the WCCP business, so please don't get up and leave when he's done, but in the interest of making the most use of your time, we'll start with you.
Okay.
So, and we should probably do, for the tape, in case residents want to watch it at some point in time, actually say your name into the microphone like you guys do at the planning board, so it's actually on the tape, because people may not know who we are. So,
for my benefit, if you could also say what committee appointed you, so I know who's the conservation person, who's the housing person, et cetera. That would be awesome.
John Cortezis, Planning Board.
Julie Broderick, Winchester Historical Commission.
Andy Eichelberger, the Finance Committee.
Christina Marshall, appointed by the Select Board.
James Harris, Housing Authority.
And David Miller, Conservation Commission.
Great. So we're missing 3 folks, right, from the CPC?
Say again?
We're missing 3 folks from the CPC.
Missing 3 folks,
Yeah.
Chris, Jason, and Michelle.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for having me. A couple of housekeeping things. I'm happy to do this presentation interactively. David and I talked about it. It's a small enough crowd. It's a long presentation. It's pretty dense. There's a lot of information to know. So I find that if folks can just raise their hand, anyone in the room has a question along the way, it works much better for everybody to do that. So feel free to jump right in. I'm Stuart Saganor. I'm from the Community Preservation Coalition. And tonight's presentation is going to cover the basic things that a CPC and a town needs to know to implement CPA. And we'll focus a lot on the first year and the timetable and budgeting, and the big section is on allowable uses, what you can use the CPA money for. That is the most complicated part about CPA. It's probably 90% of the questions we get on our technical assistance hotline is, can we do this? So it's sometimes more an art than a science, but we'll step through it tonight. I represent the Community Preservation Coalition. We are a nonprofit based in Boston, but we're really just a combobulation of all these other nonprofits in the housing, open space, recreation, and historic preservation space. These folks all founded us back in 2000 when CPA was first passed, and sit on our steering committee still today, and we also have 8 folks from CPCs, like yourself, who sit on our steering committee, and some at-large people as well. So the coalition steering committee meets quarterly to sort of guide the operations of the coalition. We've been passed around in terms of physical location to from different partners, but we've been inside the offices of the Trust for Public Land for quite a while in downtown Boston. So we're in their space. And the things we do, I think, are typical of, for lack of a better term, a municipal trade association. Every board or committee has someone at the state level who does education, training, advocacy work, and we are that organization for all the cities and towns that have CPA, and specifically the Community Preservation Committee in those cities and towns. So technical assistance is probably the most widely used service that we do. We answer about 4,000 questions a year, whether it be by email or telephone or seminars like this. I'll show you our website in a second, and the specific page on our website that is really for you folks. Anyone who wants to be on our newsletter list, happy to put them on. The folks who are on the committee, David sent me your emails already, so you'll be getting our newsletter. We try not to bombard you too much. I think our most valuable service is the advocacy work that we do on Beacon Hill, because there are 20 or 30 bills filed every year to sort of change CPA, usually not for the benefit of the existing communities. And then there's also changes that we want to make it better. There's been 14 different amendments over the years. And so it's no accident that our office is a block from Beacon Hill, so we can be there pretty often. Chase, our communications director, was there today. We're doing a briefing next week on CPA for legislators at the State House as well. And I think that's that work we do on your behalf to keep the money flowing and keep the program good. And like I said, I think it's our most valuable service because it's not something you're going to do every day. There's a lot of places to turn to for technical assistance. But you're not going to trudge down to Beacon Hill every day to talk to legislators and educate them on CPA, and that's what we do. We work with communities to help adopt CPA, like we did here, and both times. The first time, which John was involved with back in 2007, which failed, and then the second time, obviously, was a lot more successful, which is why we're here. I will tell you one other bookkeeping matter here. We call these our bookmarks. So tomorrow morning, you're all going to get a copy of this presentation from Chase Mack, our communications director. These little bookmarks in the email will give you links on our website, and so that means there's more information at that link on this page. So you'll see a dozen of those throughout the presentation tonight, and if you want to get more information, you can get it that way. So we'll send you that tomorrow. All right, so here's our website, communitypreservation.org. Hopefully all of you have seen it, but I want to call your attention to this tab right here, the Technical Assistance tab. This is really for your committee and the municipal officials who are in the room who are running CPA. It opens up a gigantic menu, and there's literally, hundreds of pieces of information on there, and articles and data, all about CPA. And I don't know if we've ever taken anything off this website. We just constantly keep improving it and adding it and updating things. So you'll find a lot of what you're looking for in this technical assistance section, but if you can't, then you just pick up the phone or shoot me an email, and we will help you out for sure. So quickly, just to give you sort of the 40,000-foot level of what CPA is statewide and how it's doing, and then we'll dive down into the implementation aspects of it for your committee. There are 200 cities and towns that have CPA in Massachusetts. Anyone know off the top of their head how many total communities there are? 351. Very good. So we got 200 of 351. So that's 57% of the municipalities. Of course, you probably could have figured that out if someone was really good at math. They could have done the 57, right? But because we have a lot of the cities now, cities have really come into the program pretty heavily over the past decade or so. Now close to over 2/3 of the people that live in Massachusetts live in a CPA community. I love this statistic. It's my favorite stat about CPA. Every single community that has ever adopted it is still in the program. No one has ever revoked it, which anecdotally will tell you that people are pretty happy with it and they think it's very useful for their community. It's an impressive statistic because it is a tax increase, and by revoking it, you're lowering everyone's taxes. You'd think that there'd be some appetite for doing that, but people really like the program and what it can do and find it beneficial. So that's a great statistic, and I hope we don't have to change that for a while. This is our map of CPA communities. The green are the towns, and the orange are the cities. We had 10 communities on the ballot this past November on the presidential ballot. Usually the presidential ballot is the largest number of people who are trying to adopt CPA. And that's pretty incredible to think about. We've had this program for 25 years, 200 communities are in. You'd think that everyone who really wanted to be in this program would be, but here, 25 years later, we have 10 new communities that were trying it. The unusual situation this year, CPA wins a lot more on the ballot than it loses. On the presidential ballot, it's something like 73% success ratio. This is the first year ever where only these 4 towns in yellow, you being one of them, passed, which is really unusual. There were times when there were a few cycles when CPA went 10 for 10 and 16 for 16 on the presidential ballot. So I think this might be a reflection of maybe some of the national discourse that was going on that ballot and continues. But these 4 communities you're part of our brand new class of 2004, I guess. Any way you look at CPA, whether you look at that map and see the number of communities, or you look at this slide, which is the statistics of what's happened with CPA, it's been a huge success. These statistics are almost a year old now. We update them at the end of every fiscal year. So these are as of June 30th last year. But the number that jumps out at me anyways is pretty incredible, is the fact that it's generated $3.4 billion since 2001. That's a lot of money for a restricted fund that can only do 4 things, these quality of life issues. So it's really a sleeper in terms of its impact. There's been 17,000 different projects, so 17,000 votes at a city council or town meeting to spend CPA money. Historic preservation is the most popular category if you judge it by number of projects. Housing is the number one category if you judge it by money. But they all roll up pretty evenly on the money side, actually. It's kind of surprising how water finds its level on that. We're closing in on 40,000 acres of open space that's been protected with CPA. Outdoor recreation is clearly the hottest category right now. There were some changes made in 2012 that made it much easier for communities to use CPA money to rehab their existing recreational assets. You couldn't do that before 2012. That's actually a new piece of the legislation that we advocated for. It took us 5 years to get that passed, but we did. And you can see the backlog of projects that communities had not been able to afford for their parks and playgrounds and athletic fields by the amount of money that is poured into those projects since 2001. And in affordable housing, which is, we're going to spend some time talking about that because it is the state's number one problem for sure. Over 30,000 units have been in some way supported with CPA. So I always start with the money piece because that's what most folks are interested in. Your CPA revenue comes from two sources. You're probably all familiar with what we call the local surcharge. That's the 1.5% tax increase that your community voted for in November on the ballot. And that's called your local surcharge. And you're probably also familiar with the fact that you get state money every year from the CPA trust fund. That comes once a year on November 15th. You will not get a match this coming year because that will be your first year in CPA. So you get the match at the end of the year. So you'll go an entire first year, you'll collect your local surcharge money, and your first match will be in November of 2026. What's a surprise to people is where that trust fund money comes from. It does not come from the state budget. It's a specific fee that was brand new as part of the CPA legislation when Governor Cellucci signed it in 2000. And it's a surcharge on recordings at the registries of deeds in Massachusetts. That funds the trust fund, which is your matching money from the state. So when you go to a registry and you have a document to file, maybe it's an order of conditions from the CONSCOM. I think someone, is the CONSCOM person here? Right, okay. Every time you're issuing an order of conditions, thank you, because someone has to go to the registry and record it, and they're paying a fee to CPA. So, whether you have a deed or a mortgage, but any piece of paper that you're filing at the registry, when you go to the window to pay for that, there's a chart, and it tells you how much it is, and every document is a different price. Most of that money goes to the state's general fund, but $50 of every document goes to the CPA trust fund. It used to be $25, and it's not adjusted to inflation. The legislature does not like to adjust things to inflation. So by 2010, we could see that we had already lost a ton of money to inflation, and the number of communities adopting CPA was really high, and the trust fund was getting pretty low. So we started an effort to convince the legislature to raise that fee. That took 7 years to get done. But in 2019, we finally got that fee adjusted from $25 to $50, which made a big difference in terms of the matching money for communities. It's a terrific funding source. This match, any other constituency would love to have a match like this. It's guaranteed. The amount is not guaranteed, but it's a guaranteed match in terms that you're going to get it every November 15th. It's not subject to appropriation by the legislature. They can't change their mind and spend it on something else. And it is a true trust fund. The money is collected at the registries. I think there's 26 in Massachusetts. Collected at the window, goes right to the Department of Revenue. They dump it into an interest-bearing account called the CPA Trust Fund. And the only thing that can happen with that money is it's paid out as a match to you and the other 199 communities on November 15th every year. So it's really a terrific funding source, albeit one that fluctuates. And your timing on CPA was, not terrific in terms of the fact that the trust fund is in a little bit of an ebb now, and we'll talk about that in a second. The third funding source is small, but as money sits in the account here in the town, for example, you've got tax money coming in since, July of last year. No, you're starting this July. You won't be spending that right away. It's sitting in the town accounts, and the town is required to track how much interest is attributable to the CPA funds, and that's paid out at the end of every year into your local CPA fund. So that's another funding source, which, most of the time of CPA interest rates are really, really low and it didn't amount to much, but we see some communities generating a ton of interest right now if they have a high balance in their account. So the trust fund, when we saw it going south, starting in 2000, actually probably back in 2007 was the last year of the 100% match, we started talking to the legislature about what could be done. And they just didn't feel there was a recession back then. They just didn't feel that they could raise that fee at that time. But the legislature is very supportive of CPA. We're in every district, every Senate district in the state. Almost all the House districts have a CPA community. So what they said to us was, we can't raise the fee right now, but we'd like to start giving you, if we can, money from the state budget surplus. So there was a period of 11 years, up until a couple of years ago, where we were getting money from the state budget surplus at the end of every year. It varied. Some years it was 10 million, 11 million, 15. The highest was 25 million in 2 of those years. But that requires, a lot of work. You've got to go up and basically fight for that money, along with every other advocacy group, every other cause, every other state budget department. And it's hard. And right now, the state's not in great shape. So there were a few great years, like that year we got 25 million into the trust fund. It's added up to about 118 million over those 11 years that we got funding. But that funding source may be a little while in coming back. The state is really in tough shape right now, and I don't think there's going to be any money in a surplus for the next couple of years, and there hasn't been for 2 years now. So we're relying on the Registry of Deeds for those collections. And if you know anything about the real estate market, there's not a lot of volume, right? How many for sale signs did you see on the way coming here today? I know I live on the North Shore. There's only 4 houses for sale in our town right now, out of 2,600 housing units. For spring, 4 out of 2,600. That's really low. And CPA is not a percentage of the sales price. It's based on an individual sale. It's volume, right? We need a volume of transactions at the registry, because no matter if it's a $200,000 house that sells, or a $1 million house, or a refinancing of a mortgage, whatever piece of paper is filed, we're still only getting $50. So if the volume is low at the registry, which it is very low right now, the trust fund's going to be low. And that's going to take some time to turn around. I think it will. If interest rates come down, that will help. Most folks are not refinancing right now because their interest rates are lower than what they have is lower than what's out there. But if interest rates come down and we get some refinancing, that was a tremendous generator of revenue for the CPA Trust Fund as well. So we'll see what the real estate market does. But if you see sales starting to pick up, you can pretty much be assured that the following year you're going to get a better match. So last year the match was 18%. Now when we say 18%, whenever we talk about CPA Trust Fund matches, we're talking about a percentage of what you raised locally. So everyone last year on the first round of funding received 18% of what they raised locally. So that first round is equal. Everyone gets the same percentage. But if you're Boston and you generate $27 million in your local surcharge, you get 18% of $27 million. If you're Gosnold, which is the smallest community that we have, anyone know where Gosnold is, by the way? Cuttyhunk? Does that ring a bell? It's a sailing island. There's 3 islands. There's Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, and then there's this long, thin of mostly unpopulated islands, the Elizabethan Islands. The last one is Cuttyhunk, which is a big sailing destination. Year-round population 50. They have CPA. All those islands are considered the town of Gosnold, and they generate $10,000 a year from their local CPA surcharge. So they got 18% of $10,000. So that was my favorite trip to do a training just like this, was to take the ferry out to Gosnold and do the training. And it's such a, not traveled ferry, obviously. There's not a lot of traffic, that it costs too much in gas when they take the ferry out to come back. There's one a day, one going out, one coming back. So the guy who runs the ferry docks it in Gosnell at 10 a.m. and waits till 4 p.m. and just hangs out on his boat because it would cost him too much in gas to go back and then come back for the evening run. So it was a fascinating trip, but I digress. So 18% is pretty low. It hasn't been that low in a while, but it has been slowly dropping as the real estate market came onto being. We had 6 new communities getting a match last year. We got no surplus funding last year, so that's why the match was pretty low. No surplus money this year either. Not too many new communities getting a match this year, but it's still, the local surcharge goes up everywhere else, so the draw on the trust fund goes up, and so they're projecting a 16% match this year. But that's not your match, because you won't get one this November. So we'll see the following year. Around now is when DOR issues their projection, maybe earlier in March. And next year, you'll need that projection to do your FY27 budget. And you'll see an email from us as soon as DOR announces their projection. So the bottom line is we need more money for the trust fund. So that's a big thing that we're working on. That's one of the things we're going to be talking about next Tuesday when we have a legislative briefing at the State House to sort of explain this to the legislature and see if we can find opportunities to generate funding for the trust fund. It's not easy, I will tell you. It's a very tough thing to shake money loose from the legislature, especially in a difficult tax environment, a difficult revenue environment for them, and with potentially some federal tax cuts coming down the line. So we'll have to see how that goes. So, any questions on the money piece, the overall CPA? No? All right, so let's move on.
And Michelle's got a question.
Oh, yes, okay, Michelle.
How much of the trust is paid out every year, and how much do you hold on to? You don't zero it out every year.
No, and the reason, there's a formula in the Act. It's Section 9, I think, and it's like 4 pages, the formula is. And there's actually 3 rounds of funding. And because when the legislature set up the formula in 1995, when they were writing CPA, they didn't know how many communities were going to adopt. They didn't know how many 3% communities, how many 1.5% communities, how many communities would have the low-income exemption. They couldn't tell. So they had to set up a formula to guarantee that the trust fund wouldn't run out of money. So you're absolutely right. The formula can never pay out 100% of what's in the trust fund. What it doesn't pay out sits in the trust fund. It doesn't go anywhere else. It still gets interest for an entire year, and it becomes part of the opening balance for the next year. There are 3 rounds of funding. The reason I didn't talk about rounds 2 and 3 is rounds 2 and 3 are only communities that adopted CPA at the full 3% surcharge are eligible for rounds 2 and 3. So you won't get rounds 2 and 3. You'll just get whatever that percentage is on round 1. By the end of round 3, I'd say it varies every year, but it's probably about 90% or even a little more than 90% of the money gets paid out. I think last year it paid out something like 60 or 70 million, and I think there was 4 million left behind. And there really is no way around that because you just don't know what the mix of communities and their surcharges is going to be. You know, if you have more communities at 3%, more communities will take more money out of rounds 2 and 3, and there'll be less left over. So it just depends. But DOR does a very good job tracking that and investing it and getting a decent amount of return on that money, and then paying it out and doing the calculations. So I should mention, you said, how much money do you pay out, as if I had the checkbook and I was writing the checks. We're a nonprofit. People think we're a state agency all the time because there is no state agency for CPA. There is no one in state government that has CPA in their job title. They don't spend a penny on administration for this program. They consider it to be a local program. And the only thing they really do is DOR keeping track of that trust fund money. And then they take in, you have to do your municipal officials have to do a lot of filings to prove out your expenditures and things like that, and they look at those. But beyond that, just that money piece, there's no one in the state who does anything. If you could find more than just the one page on the state website about CPA, there's one page with a list of the matching money. good luck, because there's just nothing on the entire state website for CPA. I think you had a question.
Yeah, what's the magnitude of those rounds 2 and 3 matches versus round 1?
Yeah.
Like last year, for
I should
example.
probably just explain the formula from the beginning, because we
Okay.
get at it through questions, because it's pretty complicated, so I avoid doing it. But the way the trust fund works is they take all the money in the trust fund on October 31st. So let's say it's $70 million. And they set aside 20% off the top for rounds 2 and 3. So that's what, $14 million. So there would be $56 million available for round 1. And so the way they calculate round 1, everyone gets the same percentage. So they ask themselves, we have $56 million sitting here. How much money can we give each community and pay out the entire $56 million? And last year, the answer to that question was 18%. If we give every community 18% of what they raised locally, we will pay out the entire $56 million. So round 1 gets paid out in its entirety. And then that last 20% is used to fund round 2 and 3. So the bump in rounds 2 and 3 is not huge, but rounds 2 and 3 are weighted. Everyone gets the same on round 1, 18%. Rounds 2 and 3 are weighted to favor small communities and less affluent communities. So that's the equalizer in CPA. If you adopt at 3% and you're small, in Western Mass usually, and less affluent, you're going to do very well on rounds 2 and 3. On the other hand, Cambridge has 3%, very big, very wealthy. They got 18% on round 1. By the end of round 3, they probably got 18.2%. Like the amount of money they got on rounds 2 and 3 is tiny because they're so big and wealthy. So that's the equalizer, is those 2 rounds.
So Stuart, people will want to know the dues we pay.
Yes.
That goes to the organization that you guys are part of.
Yep.
Nothing goes to the state. It goes to running your administrative costs. Basically.
Correct. So we're a nonprofit. I should have actually talked about that. The way we fund ourselves is primarily through voluntary dues that communities pay from their administrative budget of CPA. We're very lucky that 99.9% of the communities have seen the value in what we do and agree to join. We also have traditional foundation sponsors as well, but about 80% of our money comes from the dues. That's, it's voluntary. It is not required at all. We're not a state agency. It's not part of the law. It just gives you 5% in administrative funds, and we find that communities do feel that it's a good use of their money to help support and have an organization like us, especially since there's no support at the state level. So thank you very much for your consideration of that next year. All right, so now let's talk about the committee and what you're going to be doing. And you guys have gotten set up quicker than I think maybe everyone in the history of CPA, except for maybe Dunstable. Dunstable passed CPA kind of like the Right Lock Farm thing that happened here, where you try to pass CPA for a specific project. They did it at hyperspeed because they wanted to buy a farm, Ferrari Farm in Dunstable. But beyond that, I think you guys have gotten set up faster than anyone else that I could ever remember. I have never done a training before actually any tax money is being collected. Your tax money is not being collected until July 1st. So this is definitely a first. So you're kind of ahead of the curve here even. Some communities, year 3, they're finally getting going. Someone talked about Newbury and West Newbury, or maybe that was you. Yeah. West Newbury, 3 years after they adopted CPA, then we did the training and they got going. So kudos to you for really getting up and running pretty good.
We got a lot of eyeballs on us, I think. We're feeling the pressure.
Yeah, that's great. So in the first year, what most communities do, or what you have already started, is to assess the town needs. The Act does require that the CPC do an assessment and write a community preservation plan. And you're not creating that from scratch. You're really just looking at all the other planning documents that the town may have, from an open space and recreation plan, a housing production plan, whatever it is, master plan. Even if they're not up to date, they have valuable information to contribute to the CPA plan in those 4 categories. As part of that process, you are required to meet with all the other boards and committees in town to get their input on what they think should be priorities for CPA. There's a lot of ways communities do that. Some CPCs send each person back to their home board, so you go back to the CONSCOM, you get on the agenda for 20 minutes and say, hey, what do we want to tell the CPC? What are some priorities for us? And you bring that back to the CPC. You can invite the other board to your meeting and have a joint meeting and talk to them about their priorities. Or 2 or 3 of you, less than a quorum, can go to the CONSCOM meeting and get on their agenda and talk to them at their meeting. So it's up to you as to how you want to set that up. But that is required as part of your planning process as you're writing your plan, to talk to all the other boards and committees. You also have to hold one public hearing to get input from the general public on your CPA plan. And then you wrap that all up into a community preservation plan. And then at the same time, usually you prepare a CPA application that people can submit when you're ready to start giving money away, and guidelines, selection criteria, and that sort of thing. And I understand that's well underway. This whole process is well underway for you folks, right?
It doesn't feel like it, but but yes, I think we've got some. We put a lot of work in under Michelle's guidance on an implementation plan, and we're sort of running through that and have a lot of familiarity with other communities that we're using as models. So I think we're making progress.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. So these will be the things that we'll be working on, between now and, let's say, the fall, right? Get that public hearing scheduled at some point.
Maybe late summer.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Terrific. And get those meetings together. And again, more information at this bookmark when you get the links tomorrow. All right. So one thing I want to talk about is you're going to get to the point where you're going to prepare an application. And there are a lot of different samples out there. I wish there was one that was like the holy grail perfect. I don't think there is. But there's a general process that we always recommend. It was actually developed in Tisbury a long time ago, which is to use a 2-step application process. And phase 1, let's say that's due every September 15th. Anyone could submit an idea to the CPC. It's a 1-page, simple form. Doesn't even have any budget associated with it or costs. It's just the purpose is for you folks to determine if it's allowable. Because what we see in a lot of communities that don't have a 2-step process is someone spends a lot of time and effort preparing an application, and they hand it into the CPC, and the CPC looks at it and says, we can't fund that. That's not eligible for funding. And that's when problems start happening, right? People gnash their teeth. They're very upset. They've spent a lot of time. They call their select board. The political pressure starts, on the CPC, and it gets ugly. It can get ugly. So this process really works well for communities to immediately qualify someone, and then you invite them to submit a full application maybe a month later or a month and a half later. It also gives you an opportunity to look at the idea and give feedback to the applicant of what things you need to see in the application. So if it's a land trust looking to maybe protect some land, you might want to say to them, make sure you include a copy of the deed in the application so we can see that. If it's a historic building rehab, make sure you include a budget and a description of the historic features in the building that are going to be preserved. So it gives you an opportunity to tell the applicant exactly what you want to see. One of the biggest problems with CPA is the quality of applications. It's not like a state where there's a 17-page, application filled with red tape and all sorts of attachments. And, if one thing is out of order or missing, the state kicks it back to you. CPA tends to be, a local process with local applications. So, it can be difficult if you get applications that aren't complete, that don't have a budget, that are not ready for prime time. It's, there's no consensus in town on whether this is a good project yet, missing details, missing information, or vague. So you really want to instruct the applicant on what you need in that application. And we'd even recommend putting the full CPA allowable uses chart in the application. I'll talk about that when we get there. All right. So once you have your setup procedures done, you've got your CPA plan written, you've got an application, you have guidelines and criteria and that sort of thing, and you're well off into your first year, you do have ongoing requirements every year as well. So you do have to update that plan every year. It's not a major update. It's just a light update. If you list your projects that you funded in the past, well, you'll add the new year's worth of projects, right? If you If you put the names of the 9 committee members, you'll update that. You know, if you have revenue information on how much money you got from the state, you'll update that in the plan. So it's not a major update, but it does need to be updated every year. And by the way, the plan is not like a master plan that has to be accepted by town meeting or a body. It's your planning document. It doesn't have to go to anyone else to be accepted. You know, it's usually done by consensus. I suppose you could have a vote to adopt the final CPA plan. Probably not a bad idea, but it's not something that goes to any other board or committee for review or ratification in any way. So it's just your planning document.
So, I mean, we've seen plans from other communities that we think are pretty swell.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any reason we can't borrow liberally from those?
No, there's one reason why, but we have, I think, probably 8 or 9 plans on our website that we have looked through, and actually says right on it, we've done some light editing to take out something that might be wrong, because the last thing we want to do is put something on our website where there's something wrong in there and then have that, you know, perpetuate, because what you're talking about is exactly what communities do, right? There's been 195 plans before you. You know, why reinvent the wheel? You're all volunteers, right? And there's some great information and great ideas out there. But the caution is that there are sometimes things in there that aren't correct.
Right.
I mean, even you know, you haven't written your plan yet or finalized it, but you know, for example, I read the study committee report when you were looking at CPA, and it's obvious that they look to other communities for information. And I read the study committee report, and I said, no, you can't do that with CPA funds, or you can't do that. I mean, there weren't too many errors in there, but there were some. And that's usually stuff that comes from other communities that is just an error that's just been sort of passed down. Or maybe it's old information, the law's been amended 14 times, right? That changes too. So we're happy to read your plan too. That's one of the services we offer. Excellent. You know, if you have a draft and it's still in the draft stage, send it to us. Chase has got a master's in writing and is really good at reading through plans and making light edits and suggestions.
So when you get back to the office, do tell us which of the things you thought were incorrect in our report.
In the study committee report, I'd have to go back and grab that.
Sure.
Sure. All right, so you have to update that plan. You have to have another public hearing every single year. The law really envisions the public hearing being at the beginning of your process to get input from the public on what sort of broad criteria you want to do. Some communities don't do it that way. Some of them use it as a public hearing before town meeting to introduce their slate of projects. It's really up to you because there's not a ton of detail in the law. It doesn't even say whether the public hearing has to be once every fiscal year or once every calendar year. So whatever you adopt, stick with it. You know, if you do it in September, do it every September. You know, don't consider that to be the calendar year one and then mess that up. So you know, I would say that you know, if you want to do it the way the law intended it, you're going to do your hearing at the beginning of the process, but it's not crystal clear, and you could do it. You could do it really anytime you wanted to, but it makes sense to do it at the beginning of the process. You should, on an ongoing basis, review your CPA account balances the same way that any department head or committee receives their budget, right? So I don't know what the cycle is here in Winchester, but at some point, the finance department, you know, prints out an update for the DPW director and the CONSCOM. How are we doing on our budget? The select board, whether it's monthly, weekly, I don't know, but whatever that cycle is, that same reporting should come to you, because it might seem like it's pretty simple, the CPA fund, but it gets divided into sub-accounts and it can get pretty complicated pretty fast. Hopkinton had to hire a forensic accounting firm to unravel their CPA accounts, you know, 10 years into their program. So you want to keep on top of that, and you're a new committee, so you might not be in the regular cycle of what the town is doing in terms of who they're distributing reports to and that sort of thing. So when the money starts flowing in, there's nothing to report now, but when it does, especially when it starts flowing in and flowing out, that's when you want to keep an eye on those account balances. You're not a fiduciary board, you know, you're not responsible for keeping those records or investing that money or anything like that. But you are responsible for managing that budget. So you want to make sure you get that information. And then these are the main two things why you exist, and we'll talk about those. It's to prepare a CPA budget for town meeting every year, and then make project recommendations. And that's really what the balance of the presentation about is these two major functions that a CPC does.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
So you had mentioned that the public hearing is required on the preservation plan. Is there also a requirement of a hearing during the application process when those applications are being reviewed?
No, there's not. I mean, there are some communities that have more than one public hearing a year. They have one at the beginning of the process, then they do one for town meeting to kind of introduce their projects. Not a bad idea. You know, it's always good to have a dry run of what's going to be presented at town meeting and to do a public hearing and have all the applicants, you know, or the CPC members present the projects. But it's totally up to you folks, or up to the CPC of how they structure that. Okay. All right, so the annual budget. I'm going to not spend a ton of time on this because you've already done your annual budget for FY26, and you seem to have a really good handle on it because it was perfect. I will tell you that, again, I think you might be the first town in the history of the Commonwealth to do a budget for their very first year in CPA, because most towns, the CPC is not formed until sometime during the fiscal year, and it's too late to do a budget for the first year. So, again, kudos to you. That's just terrific that you actually had a CPC budget for your first year in CPA. Usually the budgeting is done on the same schedule that the city or town does their regular municipal budgeting. It's not required to do that. Rockport does their CPA, their annual budget in the spring, which is required for every city or town. But that can be a crazy time, you know, the spring town meeting, and you know, there's a lot of gnashing of teeth and a lot of signs along the roads, and there's a lot going on heading up to town meeting. So Rockport said, you know what, we're going to do our CPA projects in the fall, at our fall town meeting, and we're going to do our CPA budget in the fall. You have to have a rock-solid scheduled fall town meeting. I don't know if you folks do. You do have a regularly scheduled, always have a fall town meeting. So that's certainly an option. Most towns do it in the spring, though, at the same time, and have it on the same warrant as the town's general budget. When you folks do a municipal budget, you're going to work with your officials, you know, to get the numbers right. But then it does require a vote and a recommendation from your board to recommend that budget to town meeting. The town can't just put that budget on the warrant. It requires a recommendation from you folks, and for you folks to approve the final budget.
That's sort of line item by line item, or is it in aggregate?
In terms of your vote or your recommendation, I think it's just an aggregate. I mean, when someone makes a motion, I move to recommend this budget to town meeting for FY26. You know, second, any discussion, someone could certainly make an amendment, you know, at your committee level to change something if they wanted to. Probably pretty rare to have that happen, if ever, but that's certainly possible.
Can I ask a quick question about the sign in that
Yeah.
picture? I really, really like that. Do a lot of towns do that, where they kind of advertise the fact that a
So
project
many
is
that
CPA
we have on
funded?
that technical assistance page of our website,
Oh.
a whole article about signs with dozens of pictures of CPA signs. So it's really important. You know, this is a voluntary tax increase, right? You know, people didn't have to give this money to the CPA fund. And it's really important to bend over backwards to be really transparent, very engaged with the public, and letting them know what their money is going for. And the signs are a great way to do that. You can do two types of signs. You can do like a temporary sign that goes on construction sites, you know, on the fence. You know, thank you, citizens of Winchester, for supporting this CPA project. You can print them up on vinyl, and you can print 10 of those and charge them to your administrative budget and keep recycling them. That's kind of, I think that probably this is a temporary sign. This is on a washboard because there was really no place to hang it on a banner. But you can also do permanent signs, you know, like Boston does these beautiful brass plaques, you know, this project funded by people of Boston through the Community Preservation Program. So you'll see on our website in that article on signs so many different examples from all over the state. Some of them are project specific, you know. A sign goes up in front of a trailhead, you know, improvements from CPA, and sometimes lists all the other funding sources too. So you can pay for a generic sign out of your administrative budget. Project signs should come out of the project budget if it's specifically for a project. So, you know, if someone applies for funding for a project and you want to condition that project on having a sign, maybe you might have to not make it an unfunded mandate and increase their budget by $1,000 so they can then go ahead and fulfill the requirement of doing a sign. But that's up to you. It's not required by the law, but it is very, very good idea. In fact, I said no one's ever revoked CPA. It has been on the ballot 4 times to revoke it, and all 4 failed. One of them was Northampton. Northampton is the most aggressive about their signs. They have these white banners. You'll see it on our website, actually. I have a picture of it, that they put on every construction site, and 2 or 3 of them. And afterwards, they really attributed the fact that those signs, which were all over, and people could see these parks being built and these historic buildings, the Academy of Music, which is right on the main drag. You've got a spectacular town hall. They have a really interesting one with turrets and castles and everything, and that was fixed up with CPA. And they really felt that the signs are what, really helped people understand the program was worth keeping. So it was great.
Great, thank you.
Good. No one's ever picked up on that before. That's good. All right, so the CPA budget. The state did not put a lot of requirements on you. And that's a good thing, because right now, 86% of the money, or 84% of the money is local, right? The state's only contributing 16% this year. But they do have one rule that they put into the CPA legislation, and that's every year you must spend or reserve 10% of your annual revenue in each of these 3 categories. Your annual revenue would be your local money plus your estimated state money. For FY26, the only year your annual revenue is only your local money, because you're getting no match next year. So when you did your budget, you just based it on what you expect to receive from your local surcharge. So those 3 10% requirements are really the only requirement on your spending. And the rule is spend or reserve for later spending. So you don't have projects yet, your budget that you recommended to town meeting reserved 10% in each of these 3 categories for later spending. You can also get at that by actually funding projects that are worth more than 10%. This is a cleaner way to do it, because there's a paper trail, and you know exactly that the requirement has been fulfilled when you see it on the warrant this way. I'll point out that the open space and recreation reserve can be used for both types of projects. When we say open space with CPA, we mean conservation land property. And when we say recreation, we mean active parks, playgrounds, athletic fields, community gardens, trails, and that sort of thing. They share a reserve account. There is no separate reserve account for those 2 categories. You know that you can also set aside 5% for the administrative fund as well, and then the rest of the money, you can do whatever you want with it. You could, one year you have a tremendous housing opportunity, and you spend 75% of your budget that year on that one project. That's fine. That's undesignated money is really dependent upon what you see come in the door in terms of applications and what the priorities are uncovered by your CPA plan. All right, so here's what the budget would look like, similar to a chart that you're going to see on your town meeting warrant. You first set aside your 3 10% reserves. You can set aside up to 5% for administration. You could put projects into you don't have it this year, but you won't have any projects, but that would go into your recommendation at town meeting. And whatever is left, you're putting in what's called a budgeted reserve. And you did that because all you had this year was your 3 10%, right? So you had 70, and your administrative fund. So you had 65% of your anticipated revenue that you don't have a use for yet. You want to ask town meeting to put that in a budgeted reserve. And you did that when you prepared your budget. Someone was definitely paying attention over in the finance office. A budgeted reserve is just a parking place for that money. Just like your general municipal budget, when you do your budget in the spring, you have to park every dollar you expect to receive in revenue into some department. You have to park it in the police department budget. You have to give out the DPW budget. And whatever you don't put in an account, either a temporary holding account or a department budget, when the tax rate is set in December, you lose access to that revenue. So if you had left that 65%, which was probably hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? Just hanging out there as anticipated revenue, there's no problem with that until December when your tax rate is set. And then you'd lose access to that money until the year ended and the town closed its books. So if you wanted to spend your money at next spring's town meeting and you didn't park it somewhere in an account, you wouldn't have access to it after the tax rate is set. So, and that's the same for the municipal budget too. You know, if the town anticipates receiving, you know, $200 million in revenue, and they do a budget for $200 million and park all $200 million somewhere, and they ended up collecting $202 million, you know, they can't appropriate that extra $2 million after the tax rate is set. They would have to do it before the tax rate is set. So it's not a CPA quirk. It's the way municipal finance works. So it's important. It's not required, but we recommend you use a budget reserve. And I was really happy when you sent me the sample of the budget that you folks had done one, because now you'll have that money available throughout the entire fiscal year if you need it at a town meeting at that point. All right. So any questions on the budgeting at all? All right. So let's move on to the real fun part. Oh, signs. I forgot about that slide. Yeah, there's a ton of them, both temporary and permanent there, in all sorts of different towns. All right, so the fun stuff is spending the money, right? This is a quality of life program. The money is restricted to these 4 wonderful categories that make your quality of life better, and that's really the magic of the program. So there are 2 categories of spending: your 5% administrative account, and then your 95%, which is your project account. So let's talk about the administrative account first. That is an administrative account for the Community Preservation Committee's operations. It's for running your committee. It is not the expense account for the CPA program in Winchester. Let me say that again. It's your administrative budget for what expenses you have running your committee. It's not the expense budget for the CPA program in Winchester. There is no expense budget for the CPA program in Winchester. If your town treasurer spends time working on the finances, or the finance director, if the town manager spends time working on a CPA project, if the DPW is fixing up a park with CPA money, you know, their time spent is just part of their regular job. There is no way to charge the CPA budget for any of the expenses that are incurred outside of this committee. And this is the point at which sometimes the select board people or the finance committee take out spitballs and like fire them at me or something like that. And I think Michelle is she's smiling now, but she was scowling a second ago, I swear. You know, that's a disappointment to people that you can't, you know, grab some of that CPA money and backfill the town's coffers, but that's called supplanting. And that's one of the holy grails and one of the most, you know, lines in the sand that the Department of Revenue checks for and runs, is that CPA money can never find its way back into the town's general fund. You know, if the town does a project and then they apply for CPA money, you can't reimburse that. It's too late. The money has to be appropriated directly from CPA for a CPA use. So what you can use your administrative account for, well, you can hire staff. I'd say anecdotally about 60% of our communities do have a staff member, usually the larger communities. Sometimes not in the first year. You know, it becomes more, the workload definitely increase when the projects and the applications start coming. But that is certainly an option for you folks to spend it out of your 5% administrative account. Unfortunately, though, you cannot give that to anyone who works for the town already, right? So some towns assign a staff member, usually from the planning department or economic development, to kind of assist the CPC, and that's great, but you can't pay a percentage of that person's salary. That would just be part of that person's regular 40-hour week if they're assigned to the CPC. But a lot of towns do it that way. You know, I think the towns that do it that way feel like, you know, having someone from the economic development or the planning department, you know, here watching CPA is beneficial for the town because they can, you know, steer things in the direction and you know, make sure that you're aware of the priorities of the town. So they don't mind providing a staff person. But other towns just don't have anyone that has any extra time. But you could hire someone new. There are only probably 3 communities in the state that have a full-time person. And only 1 community that has more than 1 full-time person. That would be Boston. So most of these are part-time employees. If you do have someone who works in town part-time already, and you want to add to their hours, that's not supplanting, because that person is only in the budget for 20 hours a week. In fact, that's what we did in my town when I was chair of the CPC. We had a CONSCOM agent that worked 32 hours, and he was going to leave because he wanted a 40-hour-a-week job. And it was just at the time when we were starting to do a lot of projects, and it was getting too much for the volunteers on the committee. And so we approached the CONSCOM and say, hey, can we buy those last 8 hours? He's not full-time. It's not supplanting. And he'll work 8 hours a week on CPA and 32 hours on conservation business. And they loved it because they were able to keep Ross, and he's still there, and that was 25 years ago. So it worked out really well. Probably retiring soon. So that's the way you work on staff. And so that's probably the most common use of CPA administrative funds. But when you get applications, you might want a consultant or someone to look at it. You get a historic application, you're like, well, gee, is this being done according to the Secretary of Interior standards, which is required for CPA? Maybe we need a historic consultant to review these blueprints before we spend $2 million and recommend it to town meeting. So any due diligence in the project phase is fair game for the administrative account. CONSCOM comes and says they want to buy a piece of conservation land. CPA law says you need an appraisal on that. Perfect expense for the administrative fund. It is not for project expenses, and that's why we separate these two budgets, 5% and 95%, because the administrative fund, people ask all the time, we forgot about something in our project budget, and now we're in the middle of construction. Can we use administrative funds? No, they're not project funds. They're administrative funds. So, you can't do that, unfortunately. And so it's not for project expenses or reimbursing, municipal expenses of people that have spent time on CPA. One way that you can kind of anticipate something is not okay with the administrative fund is if someone else is asking you to do it. If there's another board or committee asking you to use your administrative fund, that's a tell. Is that I just learned that. Is that a thing in cards? A tell?
It is.
That's a tell that this is probably not okay. Like if the CONSCOM comes to you and says, we want to do some type of study, can we use your administrative funds? No. CONSCOM should get their own administrative fund from town meetings. So people don't apply to the administrative fund. They apply for projects, but the administrative fund is yours.
Can I just ask a clarifying question about the professional help, like appraisals and so
Yep.
forth? So if somebody comes with a project and part of their project includes an appraisal of a piece of land, that appraisal could be part of their project budget. Is that right? But if somebody came, say, with a project and they hadn't done the appraisal and the committee wanted to see an appraisal, then we could pay for that out of our...
Okay, appraisals are different than anything else because they are required, right? It's not required that you hire a consultant to review, plans for a historic building. It's a good practice, but it's not required. Appraisals are different because they are required. So you could certainly put that in the project budget, but then the appraisal wouldn't be done until after town meeting. So you'd be asking town meeting to vote to appropriate a pot of money for a piece of land with not backed by any appraisal, and town meeting might say, well, wait a minute, how do we know it's worth $1 million, right? So appraisals, you do those before town meeting.
Okay.
And that is fair game for the administrative budget because it's really, if you think about it, it's information you need to decide whether to recommend this, right? If, the CONSCOM's coming and saying, we have this piece of land we want to buy, the owner wants $1 million, before you put your stamp of approval on that, you're going to want to know whether that land is worth $1 million, right? So you're going to want to do an appraisal. And it's very hard to get that money elsewhere. Like the CONSCOM probably doesn't have money in their administrative budget for appraisals. You don't buy land every day, right? So if you can pay it out of the administrative fund, that makes the most sense.
Okay, thank you.
So that's the requirement for appraisals and the timing of it.
Stuart,
Yep.
Implicit in everything you're saying is there's some sort of audit function somewhere. Is that the DOR somehow gets report?
Very interesting question. So there is no CPA police. That's certainly not us. People always call us and say, hey, something's going on in our town. We're like, we're not the CPA police. There are a series of forms that the town finance department has to file every year with DOR. The CP1, the CP2, the CP3, the A4. I don't even know the other ones. But there is pretty heavy financial reporting requirements on the part of the town. It's all automated. It goes through the online, something called DLS Gateway. There is one that you guys are required to fill out, which is called the CP3, which is the listing of what you spent your money on, the project report, basically. And we will help you do that the first time you have to do that. It's an online state database that you have to go in. It's pretty clunky and old, and Chase is the master at that. So we will help you the first time you have to put your projects in, but that's going to be a good year or more from now when you have to file that report. But yes, there is a pretty heavy schedule of reporting requirements from DOR. Yeah.
Is there an average that is less than 5% that most communities might spend on
Yeah,
admin?
it's very rare for a community to spend the full 5%. Very rare. Boston might be the only one in the state that spends 5%. But their budget's so big, maybe they don't even spend 5%. Yeah, it's probably, it's minimal, there's a lot of communities where the only thing they spend on their administrative fund is our dues, anecdotally, it's probably averaged out to be 1 or 2% of the, if that. In some communities, virtually nothing. Cambridge is a big community, but they don't have a staff person. Their municipal staff just helps out the CPC. It's part of the way they've always done it. They have no administrative expenses except the dues they pay to us, which they choose to do. So it's pretty low. But the reason why we recommend you appropriate the 5% every year is there's no danger in doing that. Because what happens to that unspent money, let's say you only spend 1% and there's 4% left over, when the town is closing the books at the end of the year, one of those DOR forms, when they go through, it's going to get to the point and say, how much money did you have left in the administrative? Add that back into your CPA fund here. So it just goes right back into your CPA fund, anything that's left over. And town meeting hopefully has given you a new 5% administrative budget. So the administrative budget lasts for only that fiscal year. It doesn't carry over. The town will automatically close it out, put the money back in your CPA fund available for projects, and then town meeting hopefully has given you a fresh pot of money. So the reason why we recommend to do the 5% is you don't know what kind of things are going to come up during the year, right? You don't know if the CONSCOM is going to come with a piece of conservation land and need a $10,000 appraisal, right?
Yeah.
So it's better to have that money available to you for the whole fiscal year, and there's no danger because it's going to go right back into your CPA fund. There's never a situation where leftover CPA money goes into the town accounts.
And following up on Julie's question about appraisals, are there any similar things that are also eligible for admin budget? Like you said, you might want to know if the property is really worth that before deciding whether to recommend or not. I'm imagining that there could be like a project, budget that you might want to get an independent assessment of whether that budget is accurate.
I mean, budgets are really important. That's one of the things that I see CPCs get tripped up a lot on is, they don't get detailed budgets in their applications. And then it's very difficult to determine what the money's actually being spent on. And if you can't see what the money's actually being spent on, you don't know if it's allowable or not. So, I suppose I've never seen that, but if you had a budget and they said, we tried, we just couldn't get good estimates, and you said, well, we'll hire a cost estimator because we need to know to be able. So yeah, that would be a fair administrative expense, absolutely. And these due diligence things that happen are why we always recommend leave yourself far more time than you ever would imagine you'd need between the time your applications are due and the time the warrant closes for town meeting. Because you never know what kind of due diligence you're going to have to do. You might need an appraisal, and those appraisers take months. You might want to hire a consultant to look at plans. You might want to hire a consultant to do what you're talking about. So make your application deadline way early so you have time to do proper due diligence. The communities that I see run into trouble, have their application deadline on January 15th and the warrant closes on February 28th, and they get an application and they look at it and it's not ready for prime time and it's missing all sorts of information and they don't really understand it and the pressure's on and people are applying political pressure and people can't make, you try to schedule meetings so you can have the time to review it and people have vacation schedules and, it gets crazy to try to, spending money takes a lot of work to do it properly. And the more time you have, the better result you will have. You will be going to town meeting with a much better project if you have enough time in your due diligence phase to really, that's sort of your job, is to take the application and make it better and make it bulletproof and make it solid for town meeting. That's kind of your job, and it can take some time. This is just me on a soapbox for a second. It's kind of what your, how you look at your CPA program. And it's really very different from how the town has always looked at the money they have to spend in their general fund. A municipal budget is pretty much a top-down affair, right? It's hard for the average citizen to really have much impact on the municipal budget. It's the select board, the finance committee, the town staff, the town manager, the finance director, and that sort of thing. That's really where the energy for the budget comes from. Very hard for individuals to have an impact on that. But CPA is designed by its very nature to be the exact opposite of that. It's a bottoms-up approach to spending the money. The ideas come from the community. It's a voluntary tax increase that the community gave, right? That's why it's called the Community Preservation Fund. And the towns that really understand this and prioritize things that the community wants to see, as opposed to prioritizing things that might bail out the general finance budget, because every general finance budget of every city or town is under tremendous pressure right now. But the communities that really get that this is a voluntary tax increase restricted to quality of life things, and think of it as a bottom-up where the ideas bubble up, it really have phenomenal CPA programs. It's where there's a little gnashing of teeth between these two competing pots of money where we see issues happen. So it's just a feeling and what the intention of the CPA is, but it's really a very different way of thinking of spending your money and what the money is for than the general municipal budget. So, all right, come down off the soapbox. All right, so how do projects happen? Pretty simple process. Although the CPA legislation says nothing about how projects happen, it just says you'll do a CPA plan, come up with your recommendations, and send them to town meeting. But we've turned it into a program. Every community has a paper, or an online application. They submit it to the CPC. There's that due diligence period with the CPC. CPC takes a vote to recommend, and then town meeting votes to appropriate the money for each project. So pretty simple process. Even the town meeting, oh, sorry, yes?
Can the town meeting that vote amend the budget that's...
You are a soothsayer, because that's what my slide is about right now on the screen. So it's pretty similar to any other vote at town meeting, but it's a little bit more restricted with CPA in the fact that it's a restricted fund. Town meeting can approve your recommendations. So vote yes, we want to do this project, we want to build this playground. They can reject it, no, that's a terrible place for a playground, or that's too expensive, we don't want to do that playground. They can also amend it, but only to reduce the amount. So that is eligible. Someone can say, no, that's the Taj Mahal playgrounds. I moved to amend the cost to $250, and we figure out how to build a playground for $250 rather than $500,000. That's legal. The fourth one, I don't know what the legislature was thinking. It doesn't really make any sense. It's never been used. But town meeting could reject the project but order the money to be sent to the reserve account for that category. So it's a housing project. They don't like it, but we still want to do housing, so we're going to have that money amended to send to the reserve account. I don't know how that would work on town meeting's floor. I think this was put in there probably because if communities were counting on that project, if they didn't, remember the rule on 10% is spend or reserve for later spending, if they weren't doing the reservations and they were counting on projects to fulfill their 10%, and there was one housing project, and that was going to be far more than 10%, but if town meeting votes no, now they're in violation of the law to spend or reserve 10%. I think this was their awkward attempt to do that. I just don't know how it would work on town meeting floor. And most communities just put the money in the reserve account anyways. So
at the town meeting stage of the process, do I take it that town meeting is going to vote project by project, that the CPC committee will bring a list of projects and the total amount, but we would be voting project by project? Is that how it works?
Yes. The format of how it appears on the warrant is really locally controlled and different in every community. But, some communities have one warrant article for each project, right? You get to a bigger community that has 70 items on their town meeting warrant, do you want to add another 12 warrant articles, right? So bigger communities sometimes will group them into a CPC, actually two, we prefer to see, and DOR does too, two CPA articles. If you're going to group all the projects together, the first one is the budget, which we talked about. The second one is your project recommendations, because they are two separate budgets, right? If you do that, if the town groups them into one warrant article, it is just like your general municipal budget, whereas each line item, each project is considered a separate appropriation. So someone could move to vote. So some towns group them in one warrant article, but vote on them individually. Some towns call for a vote on the whole thing and allow you to stand up and call for an individual vote. It really is local custom on how you do
Just
that.
a follow-up, so conceivably, you could have a scenario where there's 10 projects that are being voted on, but maybe 2 of them are get voted down.
Yep. Oh, absolutely.
It doesn't affect the other ones.
It does not affect the other ones at all, right? And that's also why one of the options is not to increase the funding, because the CPC might have recommended, the 100% of their budget, right? So you can't really increase funding in that case. And it doesn't work like the municipal budget where you can't increase the police department's budget line, but you have to then reduce the fire department's budget line. It doesn't work like that because the projects are so different. So some of them might be grants to nonprofits, some of them might be town projects. It wouldn't work that way. So absent from this list is substantive amendments to the article. If the CPC has recommended, up to 20 units of housing at 65 Johnson Street, and someone stands up to amend that to say we only want 5 units of housing, and a better place would be behind the DPW garage on Wallace Street. Well, now, if that amendment was accepted, now it's not the project that the CPC recommended anymore. And one of the basic tenets of the CPA law is that town meeting cannot vote on anything unless it's been recommended by the CPC. That doesn't exist really for any other board or committee, that town meeting is prohibited from voting on appropriation unless the committee has recommended first. That's pretty unique. And it's because it's a voluntary tax increase. So they really wanted to put those checks and balances and put the power vested in the 9 people from the community who are on this committee. So a substantive amendment can't happen with CPA articles because it wouldn't then be the same project that the CPC recommended. So where we see that play out is in cities where the city council is meeting every week, and they know they can't amend the project, but they can say, we don't like this and this about the project, so we're voting it down. Come back to us. And then the CPC has to decide, are they going to make the amendment themselves that the city council wanted? But you don't see that in a town meeting form of government. That doesn't really happen. All right. Let's move on. All right. The CPA legislation says very little about who's eligible for funding, but some general patterns have emerged over 25 years. The 2 most popular people that apply for CPA funds are the town themselves. If the town manager has an idea, he submits an application. If CONSCOM has an idea, they submit an application. And then I don't think the legislature ever dreamed that CPA would be used for funding nonprofits and community projects, but it has happened a lot with CPA. If you read the law, it doesn't say anything about that, and if they had anticipated that, I think they would have made things a little less awkward sometimes. But it's absolutely a huge part of CPA in almost every community, to do a mix of town projects on town property and some private things as well. The key is that there has to be public benefit to those private projects. You cannot use public money to benefit a private entity. You can give public money to a private entity if they're doing something that's going to benefit the public. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. A very specific question. I see that up there. How about a 501c4 organization? Is that something that has been funded in the past?
So C4 are the lobbying organizations?
Well,
advocacy?
They're advocacy community organizations, but there is a lobbying component.
Yeah, it doesn't say. I put that up there myself, since it doesn't say anything in the law about actually who can apply. Okay. But I was trying to give you themes. But I have a hard time. I think we get tripped up on a 501c4 is what they were going to do with the money and whether that would be an allowable use.
Okay.
CPA is really a capital improvement program to physical things, housing units, historic buildings, land, and C4s are more about programming and advocacy and outreach, and CPA can't fund any of those things. So I think that's where you, technically no problem with it, but I think you'd find that the types of things a C4 does would not be eligible for CPA funding.
Thanks.
Yeah, the phrase you've been using is quality of life.
Yes.
I don't remember really hearing that before associated with this, although it makes sense. Can you elaborate on that a little
Yeah,
bit?
I think that's really from us, just over the years of how we've referred to CPA. But that really comes from a gentleman named Bob Durand. Bob was the originator of CPA, and he always viewed it as a program that was going to help quality of life in communities. So that's really his sort of vision for CPA. He wrote the original legislation in the 90s, filed it when he was a House member, refiled it when he got to the Senate. It still didn't pass. And then he was appointed Secretary of the Environment under Governor Cellucci, or Weld, I forget which one. And it passed while he was Secretary. So that's really just from Bob and his vision. This is a unique Massachusetts program. There's no one else who has anything like this anywhere else in the country. This was invented here and so far really only been implemented here as well. Yeah, John.
Can you say a couple of words on allocation to religious institutions?
Yes. Yep, we're going to get to that now. So, again, because the CPA legislation does not have a yes and no list, this is only a caution here. But if you get an application from these three, they deserve a little bit more scrutiny. This one is probably a no-go in any instance. It would be really difficult to give public money to a non-incorporated entity, the Friends of Johnson Park, or the Minuteman Neighborhood Association. A lot of cities have neighborhood associations, and some of them are 501c3s, but a lot of them are not. Who's the town going to write the check to? When they do something like that, there has to be an entity with a tax ID number. So, non-incorporated entities are probably not a proper applicant that you could ever find a way to fund. Some communities that have a lot of historic homes, after a while, someone will figure out, well, gee, it doesn't say a historic private home is not eligible, so I'll apply for money for my new roof. And in some cases, that can be a good thing to do. Exterior work only, maybe beautiful homes in a historic district, that keeps up the appearance of the district. But it's not for the faint of heart. It's a very difficult type of project to do. I know of only 2 or 3 communities in the state that do that. They're all very large cities that have whole departments to function in that way. So I think, do you really want to be sitting at town meeting voting on Mrs. Johnson's, former tavern that she lives in that was the scene of the Underground Railroad? Well, it might be a significant building, but, maybe people don't like Mrs. Johnson at town meetings. So that's an awkward one. And then the religious institutions, which is what you asked about. So up until 2017, I think, we all merrily went on our way thinking that these religious buildings in our New England village towns are a fabric, they're part of our fabric. They are historic. They are clearly, sometimes the seat of government before 1840 was in the church. What more quintessential scene in New England of the town green with the church on the end? So there were hundreds of projects to fund rehabilitation work in historic religious buildings in the historic category. But not everyone, loves that. And there's a separation of church and state lobby who doesn't like those sort of things, and they sued the town of Acton back in 2017. There have been some CPA lawsuits. You asked sort of about, how things are monitored. There is always the citizens who can monitor their CPA program through a 10 taxpayer lawsuit too. They're pretty rare, but this one was a big one. And it was so big, it's the only one of only 2 CPA lawsuits that ever gone to the Supreme Judicial Court in Massachusetts. It went all the way to the SJC. And the town spent $250,000 defending an $80,000 grant to a church. But Acton firmly believes in the rights of town meeting to spend their money the way they want to spend their money. So they defended it to the hilt. And unfortunately, the decision was really muddled. They made one decision, that made it clear that stained glass religious images were not okay, but they remanded the rest of it back to the lower court with some advice, and then the church finally withdrew the application. So it never got really finished litigating, and so we kind of are left with a little bit of a mess on these grants to religious institutions. Since then, we really thought it would sort of put an end to them, to be a real chilling effect. I'd say most communities have actually gone ahead and done these things. And there is a three-part, test that the SJC recommended called the Helms test. It's really complicated. That's probably the only project where you really want to take it and say, thank you, we'll look at this, and then send it to your town attorney. That would really be, most CPA allowable uses are pretty black and white, but that one, since Acton, is very muddled. And so that's what we recommend to folks, is that they send it to their town attorney and ask them to step through the Helms test and see whether they can fund that project or not. We are finding that a lot of communities are still doing it, but some are not. And by the way, you don't want to have a blanket policy not to fund religious institutions, because then you can be accused of violating the federal anti-establishment clause, which says you can't discriminate against anyone just because of their religion. So if you tell the church, no, we're not going to take your application, they can sue you for discriminating against them just because of their religion. If you go ahead and fund the application, taxpayers can sue and say we don't want, we want separation of church and state. So it's really put the CBCs in a little bit of a hard spot, which is why it's probably the only thing that we recommend, a full legal review on. I think some folks would love to just say we're not going to do it, but there's danger in that too. So these lawsuits are from a state law called actually it's an amendment to our state's constitution called the Anti-Aid Amendment. That's where the difficulty lies. In the 1850s, there was an amendment to our constitution that said public money cannot be used to fund private organizations. It was done when the Irish Catholics were coming in and they wanted to start their own religious schools. And whatever religion was in power, Protestants maybe, I don't know. Back then, it wasn't around in 1850, but they passed this Anti-Aid Amendment to sort of squelch that. And there are similar type of amendments in many, many states in the country that date from the 1850s. And it's still an amendment to our Constitution. It's been interpreted through court law that says you can't give public money to a private organization for private purposes, but you can give public money to a private organization if it's fulfilling a public purpose. But the religious one is the one where there's some friction there. So does that answer whoever's question about that? Someone asked about religious. Okay, great. So for projects, here's the Anti-Aid Amendment right here. I probably spoke too soon. So I sort of stepped through what this means. It does apply to all private projects, not just religious ones. So whenever you get an application from an organization that is not on town property, you really need to have an open discussion about what is the public benefit of this, right? So if there's a beautiful museum open to the public in town, and they apply for money to fix up their handicap accessibility or their facade that looks terrible, there's clear public benefit to that, right? It's a building, it's used by the public, it's visible from the public way. But if they applied to put new carpeting and paneling in the executive director's office, well, what public benefit is there to that, right? It's not a publicly accessible part of the museum. So you really need to look at private projects carefully against the Anti-Aid Amendment and make sure there is some protection of the public's investment in that building. One of the most popular ways is for the town to take a preservation restriction on the building back in return. We'll give you $200,000 to fix up your historic museum. You give us a preservation restriction which needs to keep the museum looking great and historic and up to standards forever, and an asset of the town. So there are a lot of ways to fulfill the public benefit on these private projects, but you really want to be very deliberate about having an explanation of what is the public benefit for that project. All right, So this is the last big part of our presentation tonight. This is the CPA allowable usage chart. So we kind of danced around what you can spend the money on. And when CPA was first passed, there was a section in there called 5B2, which tells you what you can do with your funding. But it's a section only a lawyer could love. You know, it's so complicated. And, you know, it's the CPC shall make recommendations for the acquisition, creation, preservation of open space and the rehabilitation of open space that was acquired or created with CPA funds. And then it goes on and on and on through all the categories. And honestly, that's when I was chair of my CPC, we really didn't know what we were doing. We didn't really know what the money could be spent on. And then early on in the history, DOR came out with this chart. This is our simplified version for presentations. There is an official DOR version on our website that has all the definitions of these words around the edge. When they came out with this, it was like, you know, like a picture's worth 1,000 words, right? It was like a light bulb went off that made it a lot easier to determine whether something is allowable or not. Not easy, because it is not easy, but it made it easier to have this chart. And basically the way you use this chart is a surprise to some people. Everyone knows the categories, right? You know those 4 restricted categories in CPA. What folks don't realize is you cannot fund a project unless it is justified by one of these verbs. So CPA can't fund everything related to history or anything related to conservation land. It has to be a project that is described by one of these verbs. And that's why you need a budget. You need to look at the budget and see what's the money going to be actually spent on. And then you take that line item in the budget and you look at the chart and you find the box on the chart that says yes. If you find the box that really describes that task and it says no, it's not eligible. So you have to find a box to stuff every expense from a project budget into. Usually it's all the same. You know, you're fixing up this historic building, you know, by putting a new roof on and, you know, storm windows, etc. Well, that's all rehabilitation of a historic resource, right? So that's the way you use the chart. Yeah.
Can I ask how you define preserve versus rehabilitate and restore?
Yes. So these verbs and actually the categories all have definitions in section 2. Actually, except for create. There is no definition of create. Every state law has a definition section up at the front. I'd love for you to all read the entire CPA legislation, but it's 17 pages. Don't do it late at night. But if you're going to read anything, read section 2. That's where the definitions, and that's really where the rubber meets the road. Because that is the question, right? What does it mean to preserve something? And so there is a definition of that. This is the squishiest definition in the CPA, and it's where the most gray area stuff happens. Because the definition of preserve is protection of the asset from injury, harm, or destruction. So, a historic building, the roof is 40 years old and water is pouring in and harming the building, that's clearly a preservation project. You are protecting the building from injury, harm, or destruction. But you could also justify hiring a security guard for the night duty because he's protecting the building from injury, harm, or destruction, right? So, you know, you can take this verb and go way down and have 10 degrees of separation, you know, back to the original asset. But the proper way to look at those things in the preserve is physical work to an asset. Physical work to a housing unit, a ball field, a trail, conservation land, or a historic resource. So,
and rehabilitate would also be physical
so
work.
preserve is protecting it from
housing, for example.
Right. Preserve is protecting it from injury, harm, or destruction. Rehabilitating is bringing it back to its former glory, right? So, you know, restoring historic windows, you know, basic rehab of a historic building.
Allowing rain to get inside the building, would that be preserved?
That you probably could put in either category, right? Because it is preserved and, but if they're just non-functional and they're leaking air and you want to, you know, take them out and have them rebuilt, you know, that's rehabilitation. So, you know, these two do work in concert with each other sometimes, in the historic category particularly.
Yeah. The historic, it's the housing one that's a little bit
Yeah, and that,
more unclear for me.
right. And you can see the housing category actually has more verbs than any other category, and that's because the legislature knew this was going to be your hardest category. Housing is tough. It's going to be your biggest challenge, I'll bet, is to come up with good ways to contribute to the affordable housing stock or affordable housing programs in Winchester. So they wanted to give you as many tools in the toolbox, and particularly this support verb, right? That's a big one. This is the one that basically gets you funding anything in the historic category, but you can't do it. The legislature only gives that broad, they wanted to really make it easy, the housing category. If it's in support of affordable housing, you can do it. Some communities have hired housing coordinators with this box. It's the only, besides a CPA administrator, it's probably the only staff person that you could justify. If the town already had a housing coordinator, you couldn't pay for their salary with CPA in the future because that would be supplanting. But a brand new person, that's pretty rare, but we have seen communities do it. And that just gives you an idea of all the different activities that go into that support box. A lot of historic projects, people ask for funding for things that really are support, an oral history. Well, we're going to get into that in a second, so I don't want to give away my sample. Research, interpretation, museum exhibits, historic inventories, brochures about historic buildings in town. All those things are great. They're related to history, but they're not the acquisition of a historic resource, the preservation or the rehabilitation. And so it's really something that's in support. And often you're creating something new, like a museum exhibit or something like that. John?
What is maintenance considered to be?
Maintenance is never allowable with CPA funds. So it's not on the chart because it's not allowable at all.
It's not support or preserve.
Right. Maintenance, it has a definition in CPA. It's the IRS definition of maintenance. So the definition of maintenance is something that doesn't add value to the asset, but merely keeps it in a state of readiness, efficiency, and I forget the terminology that the IRS uses. There is a definite difference between maintenance and capital projects, and CPA is really a capital project fund. And those definitions are in Section 2. But that is one of the basic tenets of CPA, which we're going to go over at the last slide. CPA funds can never be used for maintenance or operating expenses or ongoing expenses to an asset.
Not related. How would a housing authority use CPA money?
Very difficult. CPA is really for the production of new housing programs and new units. So if your housing authority, not many are, but some do build new housing, that's where a housing authority absolutely could apply for CPA funding. Or the housing authority was going to run a rental assistance program. They could apply for that. That's in the support box. There are some very limited things you can do on existing housing authority units, but not much. CPA was not designed to support existing housing authority units. Existing housing, it's for the creation of new affordable housing. The legislature had to pick their poison of where they were going to, the CPA is still a pretty modest funding source. There is a $7 billion backlog of repairs to housing authority properties in Massachusetts. The state has done a terrible job. They're all considered state properties. The state has not done a good job of maintaining those and improving them. You could spend every penny of every CPA community's money and not even scratch the surface of those. So CPA, legislature had to pick where they wanted to focus on CPA, and CPA is about new housing opportunities. That's the focus for CPA. I have a question in back. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a fairly specific housing question, so I'll try to. If the town were to own property that is not currently affordable housing, but would become affordable housing, existing assets, I assume that falls into the create bucket and not the store or.
That's exactly what it does. You would be, but you could fix up, you could study that building, fix it up, study with CPA money, fix it up with CPA money.
Okay, so that wouldn't be rehabilitate.
Nope.
That would be create.
Because it's not currently affordable housing.
Perfect.
If it's currently affordable housing, that's where you are in this box. You can't rehabilitate current affordable housing unless it was acquired or created with CPA funds. And CPA is so new, you really don't have any housing that's been built with CPA that needs rehabilitation anymore because it's, we've only been around for 20 some odd years or something. So, one thing I'll point out on the allowable uses chart, something we call around the office verb shopping, which is you go for a box to describe your project, and you pick the best box that truly describes your project, but then you end up somewhere that you don't like. And then you go looking for, can I rationalize this and find a box that says yes. We call that verb shopping. That is not the way to use the allowable uses chart. You want to find the box that truly best describes your projects. And that happens a lot in the historic category where we get those applications for research and interpretation and museum displays and that sort of thing. But those are really truly best described by support or create because you're creating something new. And you can't create anything new in the historic category. The legislature was pretty clear about that. So this will be your toughest challenge is to look at these applications. Your first set of applications, we're happy to, do a Zoom meeting, with a few members of the committee or the whole committee and go through each one and go through the budgets in each one and really sort of teach you how to apply this chart to those projects. Probably can't do that every year for every community. There's 200, but the first time around, we're happy to do that, to do an allowable use review on your projects. All right, so let's give a couple of examples, and then we're heading toward the home stretch here.
Can I ask one more question about that?
Oh, yeah.
Is it typical for CPA committees to have that checked by legal counsel, just to make sure that we've correctly gone through this?
Yeah, it's not typical, no.
Okay.
There are some communities that do it, but it is not typical. What is checked, and Michelle, tell me if this is the way your town does it, once stuff gets on the warrant, the entire warrant is sent to town council to review for format and form.
Correct.
And that sort of thing. But they're not usually digging into the details of the DPW street project to see if they're breaking any, laws, by paving too close to the conservation land. They're not doing that level of review. You would have to ask town council to do that level of review if you wanted it. And you can. Usually, most committees in a town do not have access to town council without going through the administrator's office or the select board. But if you do feel like, particularly for a religious application, you would go through them to get access. And then it's fair game for the town attorney, when they spend time on your question, to then itemize the bill. The town gets a bill every month for their legal services. They'll itemize, this was a CPA question, and the town accountant will charge that to your administrative budget. That's fair game. If the selectmen have a question on CPA, that they have to use their administrative budget for that. But if you have a question, you don't want to burden the selectmen's budget with. That's one of the first budgets usually to run out of money is the legal budget in the selectmen's office. So, all right. So let's give a couple quick examples and how you use this chart. All right. So let's say you get an application from the select board, and they have a historic building in town that needs some work. They want to do some exterior facade repairs, and they need a new boiler on that building. Okay? So that's the basic project. So step one, first of all, you want to determine if this asset is eligible for funding. And in CPA, there's only 6 historic things that can receive funds. Has to be a building, structure, vessel, boat, probably not a vase. We don't quite know what they meant, but we probably think they mean boats, like the Mayflower or something like that. Real property, document, or artifact. If it's not one of those 6 things that's going to receive funding, it's not eligible. So you can see CPA is all about hard, tangible assets that are going to have capital improvements done to them. So that's the first test. If it's one of those 6 things, that's great. Now, it has to be not only one of those 6 things, but it has to be listed on the State Register of Historic Places, or your Historic Commission has to take a vote to deem it significant in the history, culture, architecture, or archaeology of Winchester. So part of your process is going to be, when you get that preliminary application, if you go with a two-step application, you're going to want to say to the applicant, hey, this is the first time you're applying for money for your historic museum. Is it on the state register? No. All right? You need to go see the the Historic Commission. You need to get on their agenda, and you need to present them with documentation showing why this building is significant in one of these four things. It doesn't have to be all four. One of these four things is fine. And then the Historic Commission, at one of their meetings, will discuss it. They'll take a vote, and then they'll send, the chair or the administrator a memo that says, at the meeting of February 2nd, we declared the Johnson Museum to be significant in the history and culture of Winchester. And now the item is eligible for funding. So either it's on the state register, then it's automatic. If it's not, there's an alternate process. This is not designed to be a lesser bar process, right? State Register of Historic Places is the criteria for CPA. And that tells you it's significant things. The 1950 concrete bunker that the water department has with the wellhead. It's old, but is that really significant in the history, culture, architecture, or archaeology? No. So this is not designed to be a lower bar where you go to the Historic Commission and say, hey, it's not on the state register, it would never be on the state register, but we love it, it's old, and can we fund it? They should be really using the same criteria as what would be something on the register. Okay, so this building, we're assuming the application is on this building. Let's assume that it's on the register or that the vote has happened.
It is.
It is on the register. Yeah, it's a spectacular building. I mean, every time I come here, I'm just amazed that this is a local town hall building. It's just spectacular. All right, so now you go to the allowable uses chart, right? And now you have a project application, the asset is eligible, you have a budget, and you find your boxes on the budget that are appropriate. New boiler, and what did we say? The facade was the other thing. Both would be rehabilitation projects. If the facade was, who asked about, if the facade was fixing water intrusion, maybe that would be preservation, but like I said, those two words sometimes work in tandem with each other. All right. And those two things we talked about are definitely rehabilitation. So far, so good. Now, step 3. You've determined that it's eligible. Sometimes, even after a community has had CPA for years, we'll get the call and say, hey, if something is eligible, do we have to recommend it and send it to town meeting? And I'm always surprised when I get that question, because that's your whole role, is to really evaluate things. Usually you're going to get more applications than you have money, but even if you don't, you have a plan and you've uncovered the needs of the town, and your job is to sort of match the projects to what you've uncovered as the burning needs of the town. And just because something is legal does not mean that you have to recommend it to town meeting. Far be it from that. It's really up to the CPC to determine whether it is a priority for what you guys have identified in your plan and what you want to do. So a lot of times projects don't fit the plan. You have other things. It's a great project, but you just don't have enough money, and there's other things that are better priorities. A lot of times I talked about before, you don't get an application that's really ready for prime time, and you don't want to get ahead of yourself. We have seen communities where the CPC recommends a project that's still very controversial in town, and now all of a sudden the committee becomes a target. Or the program in Sturbridge, the program became a target because they were going to fund something that was controversial, and so people tried to revoke CPA because of that, to take away the funding source so they couldn't fund the controversial project. So you don't really want to get ahead of a proper town decision-making process and building consensus. It's not going to be perfect. You're not going to go to town meeting and get a unanimous vote on every project, but CPA projects do pass at town meeting at a very high clip because of the extensive process of due diligence and what we're talking about.
Can I ask a quick question on that?
Yeah.
So I'm assuming that as a committee, if we have, say, the project that the example you gave, which in theory, doesn't doesn't necessarily have a direct benefit to the citizens of the town that are paying for it, right? They may be not care that much about whether there's a new boiler or not. And then we've got another project that has sort of more global benefit to the townspeople. I assume that as a committee, we can make prioritization decisions on that basis.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, just because something's eligible doesn't mean you have to fund it. It is sometimes difficult to fund on the historic building part, to fund infrastructure things. And you're right, many citizens won't really care about a boiler. And if you tried to do private fundraising, help us fund the boiler at town hall, you're probably not going to get nearly as many donations as building a new playground. But boy, if the citizens come into town hall and the boiler's not working and it's freezing, there's clear public benefit there. So, it is a balancing act. That 2-arrow thing I told you about. There is some crossover where things that are more infrastructure type things, particularly on historic buildings, that really have been done with other funding sources in the past, can be eligible for CPA funding, and and they might not be the real sexy building of a new park or putting in a community garden or something like that. But that makes a nice, well-rounded CPA program. Like every town is under financial pressures, and if you can help out on a historic building or something like that, that's as opposed to the building just continuing to deteriorate. It's nice to have that healthy mix of, really popular, facing projects and some other town needs that maybe aren't as sexy but are really important.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Before you move forward,
Yeah.
the last bullet about is the applicant
Oh.
seeking other funding.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I didn't cover that one. This is just sort of examples of things that the CPC might factor into their review. A lot of times people come to the CPC and ask for the full amount of money for a project, either private funding or even town projects. It's usually a lot easier to get money from your friends and neighbors sitting around the CPC with their 3-page application than it is to apply to a private foundation that has 500,000 applications and there are 47 pages with 55 attachments. This is a fairly easy process. And so a lot of CPCs want to see that they're not being the piggy bank for 100% of every project. People want to see that there is community participation, even if it's a small amount. I know in my community, whenever we buy a lot of open space, very rural community, whenever we do, the CPC has always said, we'll fund 80 or 90% of it. We'll get you almost all the way there, but we still want the local land trust to run a capital campaign, have people contribute to it. It gets the word out about the project and helps it pass a town meeting. We have an open town meeting. But that's completely up to the CPC. You don't have to have a blanket policy on that. You could do that case by case, and that's probably a good idea because some projects are very hard to fund, other ways. Historic projects, there aren't a lot of money for historic projects. But if a private historical society is applying for funding, it'd be nice probably for the CPC to have them put some skin in the game and some private fundraising. Yeah.
Just one quick question on the second to last bullet, project ready for prime time.
Yeah.
If an entity is spending dollars on design or other things to advance a project through the CPA process, are those funds eligible for reimbursement from CPA funds?
Reimbursement is never allowed with CPA because of the supplanting language. So if the town has already done something or committed to doing it through a town meeting vote or hired someone, that's it. You cannot, you first must have a town meeting appropriation under authority of Chapter 44B before anything can start. So reimbursement, no. But you ask another way around your question, you're asking about feasibility work and planning and studies and that sort of thing. The rule on those with CPA is feasibility work, advanced work, planning, schematics, everything like that are eligible to the extent that they are working on an allowable use. So the example DOR gives is someone applies to do feasibility study on a new senior center in town. Well, the project that would be resulting from that would be building a new senior center. CPA funds cannot be used to build a new senior center, therefore they can't fund the study for it. Okay? So you have to look at what the study is being done for, and if it's leading to a physical, actual project, then it's okay.
So you would go to the CPC to get an allocation for feasibility study
Yep.
for a project that.
And that's pretty common. I mean, one of the best ways, even the selectmen probably like to do things this way, is to, if you have a big project, you go to town meeting the first year and you ask them for the feasibility money, and the architectural designs, cost estimating, all that. And then once all that work is done, you come back and you have an accurate cost for the actual project. Works that way, really. It's the best way to do CPA projects of any size, is to do all that work, ask for a small amount of money to get it all ready at town meeting. That's phase one of the rehabilitation of town hall, is the engineering work, and then you come back the next year and ask for the project implementation money, and you can, you put that on the warrant as phase two, town hall rehab project. It's a very smart way to do things. The only other thing I'll say about CPA is municipalities are famous for needing a study or a research or a report for everything. And that is definitely not what your citizens were thinking of their CPA money would be spent on when they gave you a voluntary tax increase. So particularly for new programs, I say, our advice is go light on the studies and the planning, and people like to see actual stuff happening. And sometimes, that short money of planning, hopefully the town maybe can find another way to fund that. What they really need your help with is the $575,000 to build that playground, right? So if you can say to the town, hey, you've always done your planning and your feasibility work on things, do that throughout your normal process. We'll fund the actual project where you really run into trouble, rather than sort of a nickel and dime situation. So, all right. All right, let's do one project real quickly that's not eligible for funding. Let's say the Historic Commission or Historic Society comes to the CPC and wants to fund an oral history of World War II veterans. There's only 7 left in town before they all pass away. They want to hire a professional video production company for $20,000. Do interviews, edit it into a 30-minute program, show it on the cable access, make it a part of the 3rd grade curriculum, and put copies on file at the library. All right, so that's the project. So it's what's the actual money being spent on? $20,000 to create an oral history video program. Are you, with that expenditure, acquiring a building, structure, vessel, real property, document, or artifact? No. Are you preserving, protecting from injury, harm, or destruction, one of those 6 things, and you're not rehabilitating it? It's not eligible for funding. It's really creating a new video or supporting, the historic preservation category as a category. So that's an example of how you use the chart both positively and negatively to step through that. All right, we're in the home stretch here. One thing I'll note from this chart is that you can see there's verbs here and there's assets here, but there's no word precedence. So this happens all the time, where people look through the CPA, the state CPA database, and they say, oh, that community used money to do something like that. It must be eligible. So we want to do it here. But precedence is not one of the things on that chart, right? And, there's been 17,000 CPA projects. Communities make mistakes. They have, different interpretations, different risk levels, different ethics. And so you really cannot use a project in another community as an example of whether it's eligible or not. You should really look carefully at your project and the details of it and the fine points of your project. So one thing we see a lot of applicants do is they go into the database, and if it's an oral history of World War II veterans, they might find 2 examples of that from communities, from 2002 who didn't know any better. Maybe I did one of those before I got that chart. I didn't know. And they put that in their application, But you should definitely not allow applicants to use examples from outside. You just don't know all the details of that example. You don't know the history. You really want to examine it from the ground up in your level. So, we can help if you have any questions, and your town council can help too. All right, so we're in the home stretch here. Just some things that we've probably mostly covered, but they're worth repeating because these are sort of the basic tenets of CPA. We talked about the no supplanting of general fund revenue. That's critical. And we also talked about maintenance or operating expenses, which are never eligible for CPA. Even if you bought that asset or fixed it up with CPA, if you buy land for a field and then you build the field with CPA funds, that's it. The town now has to cut the grass, fertilize it, pick up the trash, and replace the ripped nets. So that is an important consideration. You guys have the capital money to do really sort of great big things, but everyone really needs to think about what burdens are being placed on the town for the future if we do this. If we build this big rec complex and that sort of thing, because that's not what CPAs fund. This is sort of an offshoot of the supplanting, reimbursing town staff or expenditures that have already happened. Whenever you buy an asset with CPA funds, you have to file a restriction on that asset that is permanent. So if the town buys a historic building, they will need to do a historic preservation restriction on that building, because you don't want the town to use a restricted fund like CPA to buy a historic building, and then they go ahead and use it for something else, or don't treat it properly historic, right? Gut it, whatever. So anything the town buys with CPA funds must be covered by a permanent restriction. And this can get complicated. Again, we can help you with that. The restriction has to be approved by the state agency that's in charge of that category. So conservation restrictions, if you buy conservation land, those have to go through EEA and get signed by the secretary. Historic restrictions go to MHC, Mass Historic Commission. Housing goes to Housing and Livable Communities, and it has to be signed by the secretary, and it must be permanent. And on top of that, you have to have a holder of a restriction. So if the town owns the asset, you own the park, you own the conservation land, you own the historic building, a third party independent from the town has to hold that restriction and monitor the town's use of that to make sure it adheres to what it says in the restriction. So a common example is town buys conservation land and a local or regional land trust holds the CR and then watches to make sure the town's not dumping on the land or using it temporarily for a road project, storage area, or something like that. And then we won't talk much about this because we've run out of time tonight, but bonding is a big part with CPA. You can bond against your future CPA revenue stream for big projects that you don't have enough money for in the bank right now, the same way that the town can bond against their general tax revenue in the future. So this is really popular. We have well over 100 communities that have issued bonds, and that's up to the CPC to recommend whether they're going to fund a project with existing money, a bond, or a combination of the two. And you decide that, and you decide the term of the bond. You'll have to work with your town treasurer, of course, on that. And then you recommend that to town meeting. The difference is when the town bonds, in most cases, they need a Prop 2.5 override vote. So they need a town meeting vote and a Prop 2.5. With CPA, you've already had your ballot election. They've already given you that 1.5% revenue stream. You're just bonding against that future revenue stream, so it only needs town meeting approval. Okay. All right. So this is just some additional information since we're really running late on time. I'll let you guys look at this tomorrow, but it just talks about the different categories of things in the open space and recreation category, particularly active recreation. This is the one category where CPA does have some no's in there. Very few no's in CPA, but it doesn't allow stadiums. CPA is for only outdoor recreational facilities. It's not for gyms or facilities that are indoor. Sidewalks and streetscapes, like planting trees along the road. We get a lot of questions about that. Streetscape improvements in a historic area, those are not eligible. And it also prohibits artificial turf as well. from funding, that you can't fund artificial turf with CPA funds. The historic category, we've talked about how to qualify projects. I would recommend you grab this chart off our website. It's a great historic flow chart. Historic is the one category that has those different steps to go through. You know, is the asset eligible? Is it on the register, et cetera? And this flow chart on our historic preservation technical assistance page will really help you with that. And then the last thing, I think this might be the last slide. Housing, like I said, is going to be your toughest category. You're probably going to have to go out of your way to work on housing. It may not be the type of category where you can sit back and wait for applications. You know, you may have to call developers and have them come in and talk to you. Call Habitat for Humanity and have them come to your meeting. Tell them that you have this fund available and you want to talk about possibilities. Call in the Housing Authority and see if they're interested in adding units to their developments and that sort of thing. Housing is one that's going to require some real intentional work. And it doesn't just usually drop in in your lap, unfortunately.
For the record, 2 of our 9 members are housing.
Yeah, great.
So
one from the authority and one from the trust.
Housing Authority.
And then the trust.
And represents Housing Partnership Board and Trust.
Okay, you have a housing partnership too.
Yeah, that's John.
That's great. Yeah.
For the housing piece, can money be transferred? We have an affordable housing trust.
Mm-hmm.
Can the money be transferred directly to the trust, or does it have to fund a specific project that the trust would?
Either one is fine. It is allowable to transfer CPA money to the trust.
And then what restrictions on that money to ensure that it funds a
Okay.
future project that is a CPA eligible
Right.
project?
So the thing about transferring money to the trust is everything that the CPC recommends has to be approved at town meeting. And the transfer to the trust is like a project. That would have to be approved at town meeting. But the thing about trusts is they can spend that money without going back to town meeting. That's really the only board or committee in town that has a budget that can spend it without asking town meeting for approval of a particular project. So a lot of CPCs want to, first of all, one of the best practices is to have a grant agreement between the CPC and the trust dictating exactly what can and can't happen with that money. Because it is a very different thing when you put it under control of a board that doesn't have to go to town meeting.
Do some committees segregate, in their accounting, do they segregate CPA fund that go to
You're
the trust
required to do that,
directly
actually.
from the rest of the trust?
You are
funds?
required to do that. That's part of the law. CPA
From
money
an
has to
accounting
be,
perspective.
yes, has to be accounted for separately. And then the trust is also required every year to file a report with the CPC on what they spent that money on. And then the CPC puts that in the state database of CPA projects. So we see kind of many different types of transfers. Some CPCs are willing to just give a blanket amount of money to the trust, you know, with just the basic restrictions of it has to be housing up to 100% of AMI or that sort of thing, and let the trust use that the way they see fit in the future. Other CPCs are more comfortable funding specific projects that the trust comes to them for. And that's really up to this board. And you kind of want to have that conversation as part of your planning process and put that in your plan so that you really, because you will get approached by the trust, I'm sure. And you want to have a sort of a policy and understanding of, you know, what type of things you want to fund there.
Some communities, like this year, we're funding 10% into the affordable reserve.
Yep.
program. Some communities, in lieu of that, transfer 10% directly to the trust, and that would check the box.
That would count, yes, if they did that. Yep. And I think there probably are a couple communities that do that. That would have to be a community that's comfortable with sort of just giving money to the trust without any idea of when it's going to be spent, what it's going to be spent on, or what the plans are. So has your trust been around for a while?
3 years.
So it's fairly new.
4 years.
Is there a housing production plan
Yes.
prepared? Yeah. So, you know, sometimes it's hard to give money to a brand new trust because you kind of know it's going to sit there for quite a while until the trust really gets things going. But, you know, it sounds like your trust is well on its way and, you know, a mature trust that's, you know, really making things happen. Have you built any units yet at all?
We're getting there.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Lots of ideas, not a lot of money.
Yeah, well, this is a source for those projects. Yeah, if you've got those ideas. So that is all I have for you tonight. Maybe the last 10 or 12 slides are just examples of how other communities have used CPA funds, kind of a really inspirational video. I always pause here because it's usually 2 hours, what it has been. I can roll through these slides as quickly as 5 minutes, or you can just look at them tomorrow when I send you the presentation. It's up to you whether you have another. You want to see it? Okay. You all right?
1 minute each.
All right. Oh, I won't even go 1 minute each. Okay, so these are the most popular uses of CPA funds. In the historic category, municipal historic buildings like this one are definitely the most popular category. This is the largest ever CPA project. This is the complete top-to-bottom rehab of Needham Town Hall, $15 million project. Old project, and it's still the largest ever. That's Gloucester City Hall. The cool thing about that project was City Hall was in such terrible shape, and that steeple, every time the wind blew over 40 knots, they had to evacuate the building because they were worried about the thing falling over. So
What was the bottom left one?
the bottom left one was, I believe, Kingsbury's Town Hall. A lot of town halls, old ones, had the meeting room above. That was where town meeting happened, and then the offices were on the first floor. Very common on wood frame town halls, and a lot of times, well, the meeting rooms end up being used for storage, and they deteriorate, and the paint's peeling, and no one's using the stage anymore, and they just kind of, Needham actually put a ceiling through there and put a second floor up, but luckily they didn't ruin the ceilings. They just covered them with the tiles. And when they rehabbed it, they took out all the walls that had been built and restored the room to its former glory. But that happens to be Tingsboro Town Hall that's doing that in that photo. I will warn you, I'm not sure I know every single photo of what
I promise I won't ask about every single one. That one just looked familiar to me.
I know most of them, but we also don't have time. Adaptive roofs. So taking a building, someone asked about this, that was used traditionally for something else and using it for a new purpose. That's the shoe shop in Middleborough. That was a shoe factory, and now it's apartments. This is a decommissioned historic library in Cohasset that is now 2 units of affordable housing. And Chelmsford has not one, not two, but 3 town halls, 2 old ones and a current one, and they did a top-to-bottom rehab and turned it into a community arts center, one of their old town halls. We talked about grants to private organizations. Typically, a preservation easement comes back. Oh, there's the Academy of Music. I used that as my example. That entire facade on the main street in Northampton was redone with CPA money. That's the Abigail Adams birthplace. It was in such bad shape there was graffiti all over the front of the building. And this is her birthplace. And the Abigail Adams Society fixed it up with CPA funding. That's a great project. That's in Westfield. That's the last remaining factory that makes whips, meaning horse and buggy whips. Westfield is called the Whip City because they had 11 whip factories there at the turn of the century. And this is the last one. And CPA funds helped restore the building, and they put a little museum on the first floor of Whip City history in this factory. So very cool. Documents and artifacts are eligible to be funded with CPA. They were not originally. That was one of the amendments we worked for. Came on in 2006, and now you can restore physical work to documents and artifacts. Digitization is not eligible because you're not doing any physical work to the asset to preserve it or rehabilitate it. You're just making a copy of it. But actual work to the moldy books and that sort of thing is what CPA is for. Moving on to the conservation category. Don't have a lot of agricultural land in Winchester, and you've preserved the one you had, so that's a good thing. Probably will not see a lot of those projects here. Traditional conservation land is, that's most of the acreage that's been bought with CPA. Probably close to 40,000 acres now of traditional conservation land. Where do you get your drinking water? Are you an MWRA community?
We're both.
Both.
We have town water, half the town and another half.
Okay. I mean, you're a pretty developed town, so there's probably not a lot of watershed protection land to buy, but, Cambridge has used, millions of dollars of CPA funding to buy all the land around their reservoir. And the reservoir is in Lincoln. All the land they bought was actually in Lincoln. It wasn't even
Cambridge
in
Reservoir.
Cambridge. What's that?
Cambridge Reservoir.
Yeah. That's a very popular use of CPA funds. Playgrounds, absolutely. Again, you couldn't do that until 2012. It's one of the amendments we made to CPA, but now you can fix up or build new or buy land for.
And water parks.
If it's outdoor, yes. You know, like a little spray park or something like that. Yeah, absolutely. I don't think we're talking.
I was in the picture, I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, I mean, probably can't fund Water Country, a private commercial park, even though we love the jingle. But athletic fields, again, this is a great project in Bridgewater. That's Marilee Hunt, who was the CPC chair. She was really upset because the girls' softball field didn't exist. The girls had to use the boys' softball field, and they got the 8 o'clock time when the mosquitoes were out. Right? They always got the worst times. And Marilee, she said, we're going to build a girls' softball field. And it's so much nicer than the girls' softball field, and it was paid for with CPA. And now the boys have to come knocking if they want to use the good girls' field in Bridgewater. So she's one of my heroes. Biking trails, rail trails, all really popular with CPA, paved or stone dust. And then parks. And it doesn't have to be a traditional park either, you know, little pocket parks. I love this one. This is in Weymouth. They created this park by tearing down an old municipal garage building, a dilapidated. CPA funds paid to tear down the building, remediate the building, the soil, and they built this little pocket park because it happened to be right on the Herring River, and no one knew the river was back there. And now when they do the annual herring count, you know, where they stand right by those little blue fences there, and that's where they do the annual herring count in Weymouth. So little pocket parks and skateboard parks, any kind of outdoor athletic facility is perfect. And in a community like yours, I don't know if you have any community gardens in town, but a lot of people probably don't have land to grow vegetables, and so community gardens where you can get a little plot are a really popular use of CPA funding.
Sorry, Stuart, dog parks.
Dog parks, absolutely. Yep, people ask that all the time thinking there's something wrong with them, but they're really a park.
They have a life too, right?
Yeah, and most dogs don't go there alone. Usually there's a person with them, so it's just another type of park. But yeah, we've had a lot of dog parks with CPA. There's actually a foundation that just gives money to build dog parks. And a lot of towns have married that with CPA. I never would have believed there's a foundation that just gives money to build dog parks, but they do. Affordable housing, CPA funds can spend up to 100% of AMI to build new housing. These are the actual numbers for Winchester, so they're really high. So CPA can actually go up to 100%, not just 80%. A lot of affordable programs, including the state, cap it at 80%, but CPA can go higher, which is great because there's a need there.
Sorry, I don't know what that means, what you just showed us there.
I should probably take this one out of the samples because it's more involved. There are income limits for CPA.
I know all that. I know all about that. So how does that mean? Can you use it for affordable housing? I mean that can be part of the capital expenses to build the affordable housing?
No, this is the income levels of people who can live in the affordable housing.
Okay. I'm sorry. I get it now. Okay.
Right. So if you build affordable units, you can rent them or sell them to people earning up to this amount.
Got it.
And are still considered affordable. We've had many communities build veterans housing, which comes with services, and CPA can pay for the capital expenses, not the services. And then housing, you sometimes have to be really creative about where you put it. So we've had a lot of former places. That's actually another shot of a shoe shop. That's the Ames Shovel Factory in Easton, which was the world's biggest producer of shovels around the turn of the century. This is an abandoned nursing home in downtown North Andover. It was closed for 2 years and it was becoming an eyesore, and they built affordable housing in there, which was a terrific use of funding. Love this project. This is actually a historic print shop I forgot the community. Is it Bedford maybe? And it's now 9 units of permanent housing affordable for people with brain injuries. And this was such a successful project, they bought the same nonprofit that runs that bought an inn up in Rockport that had closed and turned that into units for people with brain injuries. And ironically, the person who introduced me to my wife, who ended up having a traumatic brain injury, is living in one of those units built with CPA funds. So really, really rewarding. We talked about funding nonprofits, and particularly, reaching out to nonprofit housing organizations like Habitat and bringing them into the fold. and brainstorming with them on ways you can get it done, or technical school programs. These are in Lincoln. These are all the guys who built some affordable housing from the technical school, which was great. And that's it. That's what I have for you. So this is our telephone number, the website, and my email is on the website as well. And I really look forward to working with you guys. You're going to be a great CPA community, I know. So thanks for having me.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.